meeting the milestone. States are testing to determine whether or not reading and math is improving. And state assessment tests generally focus on reading and math, and so as a result, other subjects also get squeezed out of being evaluated. And because other subjects are not being evaluated with equal intensity, the theory is what you don't evaluate gets neglected, gets shortchanged. And there has been a study that's been done, and we'll talk about that study a little bit later, but a study that looked at how elementary school teachers nationwide are apportioning their time each week. Now this is just elementary schools, it's not secondary schools, it's not middle schools or junior highs or high schools, so it's only elementary schools, but the theory is this is where the burden of No Child Left Behind is falling mostly upon, because it's really an emphasis on primary education. And basically for grades 1 through 6, you can see reading is up, more attention is being given to reading. Math is actually down, science is down, and history is down. One theory that a scholar at Brown University has predicated is that math doesn't take as much time to teach. You can't really use time as the singular metric for how well students are acquiring it, because it's many times problem sets that are required as homework assignments or frequent quizzes and so forth. So it may be an outlier that there's been success in math even though it's being taught less. So this is one criticism, one set of criticisms. There are some others. And these are implementation problems that also, I think, overlap into the field of evaluation. Federal law requires students to be tested annually. That is part of No Child Left Behind. Again, states do the testing, but the federal government wants to see the scores and will use the scores as a measure for how much to support states in improving their educational efforts. Basically, do well on the test scores and you'll get more support. Do poorly on them and you'll get less. Now, if you're a state and you have to go through the process of testing, what's going to be your motive? To improve the math scores, which means you're going to be testing frequently, you're going to be concentrating also your efforts in learning outcomes. But it's up to states to devise the exam. One theory, and Martin West at Brown University, who's the same guy that did this national study, insists that because it's up to states to devise the testing process, the result is that critics, or at least are stating, and West interviewed people in various states around the country, that states are making their tests easier, so it appears that students are doing better than they really are. What do you think? Is that plausible?
Isn't there some general principle of separating the implementers and the evaluators for reasons just like this?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And essentially what West is asserting is that that's not being done. You don't have a firewall between the implementing of the program and the evaluation of the program. He proposes, in fact, that what ought to be done is it ought to be evaluated at a national level. And it ought to be evaluated independently of any agency. It shouldn't be done by the U.S. Department of Education. It should be done by some independent examination board, which presumably might be made up of universities, teaching institutions, and so forth. Some accrediting organizations, perhaps. But that's exactly right. By its own count, Mississippi is tied for the best score in the country. Not to pick on Mississippi, but, you know, the statistics would suggest that that's going to lead one to be a little bit suspicious. Mississippi is a state that historically has not, on a per capita basis, supported public education at a very high level. The legacy of Mississippi and other states in its region is that for a long time, public schools have been de facto segregated, if not de jure, meaning by law segregated. And it's a little suspicious when all of a sudden you kind of rise to the top of the scale or rise to the top of your own anointed scale, tied for the best floor in the country, particularly when you compare it to a test that is administered by the U.S. Department of Education. It's a test that has no binding authority, but it's simply a standardized test that's been devised by the U.S. Department of Education in Washington called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and the state drops to 50th place. I think there are 50 states, right? So, okay. So, whoa, that's quite a difference. And a whopping 71 points lower in terms of the testing score. I'm assuming that it's probably like 100 points. So 71, so they scored a 29 out of 100. That's usually a failing score on anything, right? Any proof. Okay. Enough on that. So, the anecdotal evidence does suggest that when time to teach increases, so might scores, so that's a good thing. But basically, here you have a problem with testing, implementation versus evaluation, the separation of the two. We'll come back to that issue a little bit when we talk about evaluation and its role in the policy process. But this is a real challenge. Questions about this? Questions or comments, observations?
Yeah, I mean, I study education policy. That's my emphasis. And, I think it's interesting that the pioneer of NCOB was Diane Bravich.
Yeah.
And then after that, she wrote a book 10 years later how NCOB has caused more damage to students' learning and kind of unraveled the effects of that. But I mean, basic education is it's a pendulum that's swinging. And sometimes there's a point where you get standardized education, and there's more emphasis on accountability, and then it kind of swings back to local control and developing local standards. So it's always a dilemma for education.
It is a dilemma, and in fairness, you point out correctly, there's a pendulum. You kind of go from one, what appear to be an extreme, to another extreme. And in fairness, and this gets us into the area of policy evaluation, this is a good place in which to broach this, a lot of it has to do with societal expectations, which is what Bovens and Tart talk about in their analysis of policy failure. Oftentimes, what we evaluate and what we recommend as a result of our evaluation is a reaction to a perceived failure of a status quo. Well, we're not testing, and standards seem to be going down. Ipso facto, if we test and set the bar really high, things will improve. It makes sense intuitively, so you go to that extreme. In fact, of course, then you generate all of these unintended and unanticipable consequences, and then you're kind of back, maybe not back to where you started from, but you're in the same situation of not really having a change, an improvement in a policy outcome, which is the goal of evaluation, to see whether or not an outcome is being improved in some way, some goal is being achieved. Good point. Other questions or comments on this? Yeah.
It just seems like, I mean, it's sort of like the cost containment argument that rather than looking at the structural way that we try to intervene on these problems, we just try to make, a broad intervention, whereas if we taught teachers how to think in a very multi-level, emergent curriculum sort of way, then they would have universal ways of thinking, but we have to change the way we do professional development at the same time.
Yes, that's true.
And that's a wrong...
Yeah, I think it also, and we'll come back to that point in a little larger context, oftentimes when you have a failure like this, or a less than satisfactory outcome, it's a term I'm going to use later on, but I'll introduce it now. It's a multi-modal failure. You have a failure in several aspects of the policy system. You have a failure jurisdictionally. Who controls what? Who's responsible for what? You have a failure in terms of defining the problem is the problem that students are not testing well, or is it that they're not learning well? And are those two things necessarily equal and accountable in the same way, and testable and evaluatable in the same way? And then there may be a further failure in terms of expectations. Is it in fact reasonable to expect that educational outcomes will improve simply through providing more time in reading and providing more attention in math? Or are there deeper things that need to be done within the educational process to achieve those outcomes that may be more holistic? Maybe all of those things are true.
Well, this last summer there was an attempt, instead of rating the students via testing, there was that the LA Times published the teachers' ratings, and it was met with so much criticism, mostly I think because it named names, which, but it just seems like no matter what you're trying to rate it, there's a lot of opposition.
Yeah, you know, there's an old saying among attorneys that when you put somebody on trial for, say, a tort, a liability, not a crime, but a civil suit, what juries look at is not what went wrong, but who's to blame. We want names. Who's responsible for this? We want to fry them, okay, or we want to, fine them, or we want to put some big tort liability on them. There's this notion of personal responsibility. It becomes kind of a moral imperative. I think your notation about the LA Times series is a good example of that. Name names, it sort of sent the message that, well, it must be their fault that the kids aren't learning. Is that really the right message, and does that really solve the underlying problem, or is it a nice way of, getting attention? They're obviously to blame. Look, they're doing poorly on their scores as teachers.
Well, see, that's like a huge problem too. Like in San Diego, they're starting to actually close schools down because they're not meeting the school or the state requirements.
Yeah.
And so like it puts a lot of schools in jeopardy, and so it's not good for the students. If their schools are shutting down, they have to relocate, but it's kind of hard. You can't blame the teachers in that aspect because, for example, in San Diego where my mom teaches, she has a lot of bilingual students who don't come in and don't have the support from home, and since they got rid of bilingual education, they're not going to be able to do well as schools in San Francisco, students who are native to the language. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of problems with the way that they're going to be evaluated. That's just because you have to take into account other things other than just who's teaching and why are they teaching that.
Yeah, exactly right. And how do you evaluate all of those things? And then how do you make improvements on all those other variables that may be outside the control of the schools, much less of teachers? So another hand.
Well, I guess just reflecting what has been generally been said, it seems like a very modernist way to approach a complex problem. The idea of quantifying progress.
Right.
And in other places, well, this is done, and criticism is similar. It does not take into account critical thinking or focus on other topics or other subjects that you can argue are just as important, like even music, which involves several forms of learning styles: math, history, physics, physical education, art.
Yeah.
So it's just, it seems like
one subject I did well in. It's the only one. I missed my call, but no, that's exactly right. It comes down to what we value, what we quantify. We'll come back to this in a little while. We talk about evaluation, but there's a lot of symbolic uses of terminology in evaluation. In the 1960s and 1970s, whenever we had a policy problem that we wanted to single-mindedly attack, we would say we're having a war on. Now, if you can use the metaphor of a war, mobilization, self-sacrifice, discipline, focus, attention, it's great. It's one thing to make a war. It's another thing to have a war on poverty, a war on racism, a war on urban blight, right? Those things don't quite fit. But a couple other questions, comments.
Well, I was thinking that It also seems like No Child Left Behind is just going to exacerbate problems between, it's going to make good schools better and bad schools worse because of the way that the funding is allocated. It seems like it would make sense to fund schools that were doing worse because they clearly need improvement.
Yeah, and that exactly is one of the things that's embedded in Martin West's critique. In some of his writings, you see this. West argues that what you're doing, and this was maybe the intent, braced behind the law, is to actually create a kind of a competitive system among public schools. We know, of course, that many of the people that initially advocated No Child Left Behind felt that public education had profoundly failed because it had somehow declined in its standards and expectations. And there was also a resonance between not just the testing idea, but of supporting private schools and making it easier for parents to help create charter schools to divert resources from large public schools to specialized schools for certain populations, and so on and so forth. Many of which may be good policies, not criticizing them, but the fact is what it's doing is trying to transform the public education system into a kind of a market where schools will compete. Better, you get more.
But it inevitably plays into social determinants of health because property taxes indicate the amount of money that goes to the school. So if you live in a richer area and you have more money, then your schools are just better. So it perpetuates the poverty issue.
Yeah, it may in fact do that unless you can actually change the way in which these metrics improve, not just by a pecuniary effect, but by actually creating greater efficiency.
I was just going to make a point on the point you made earlier that it is politically difficult to try to justify giving more money to schools that are doing poorly without saying how that money would be used to actually improve what they're doing.
That's right.
I know that there's a lot of political opposition to just throwing money at problems.
That's right.
But additional funding could absolutely help. I mean,
Right.
it's just that we need like a clear, directed, yet flexible sort of way.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Accountability. I mean, this is a theme that we'll come back to in a little while. We talk in detail about evaluation. Evaluation is based on an expectation that if you can identify a failure, you can then identify means of correcting the failure. This is one of the things that Bovins and Tart talk about. And not perhaps surprisingly, as you read through that chapter, one of the things they point out is that public policies more often than not fail than they do succeed. They somehow fall short. Often because either they simply don't meet the expectation for one reason or another, or the expectation changes. It's a creeping goal, okay? Some people would use the metaphor of slippery slope. But you have a certain goal, you institute a policy, and then you say, no, wait. What we really want is better schools. No, wait. But what we really want is for having the best schools rated by some independent whatever. And then you keep changing the goal, and then what happens, sure enough, is that you fall into this trap of an unattainable goal and a non-accountable objective, an objective that can't be held to account. So let me wrap up and segue over to evaluation by suggesting these kind of summary points to chew on and think about in terms of policy implementation. No Child Left Behind, I think, suggests this as a problem. Many other public policies also allude to this problem and have this problem embedded in them. Governments often fail to acknowledge the need to synthesize, to combine in some way, what experts and policy analysts know or think they know about a policy with local, indigenous, the distinction here being indigenous often is knowledge that's inhabited by certain populations that are definitely susceptible to the problem but may be outside of the mainstream, minorities, for example, various sorts. Or street level knowledge. This is a common problem in public policy. It's a constant obstacle. We're going to come back to a couple of examples today and on Thursday. We talk about evaluation. Over-reliance on experts, and this is a point that Stone makes that I think resonates strongly with what we've been talking about for the past 20 minutes or so. Oftentimes, when you rely on experts, you not only have programs that are structured in such a way that they ignore street-level experts or become deaf, if you will, to the need for making modifications based on on-the-ground results, but you also can produce efforts that are absolutely counterproductive, that end up intimidating or even trying to indoctrinate the public. Efforts to compel immigrants to abandon their traditional folk ways. Stone talks about that as being an example of how public policies often, in fact, produce very counterproductive results by adopting policies and implementing them in ways that ignore the actual consequences on the ground. Or the safety of nuclear power. You must accept that we as experts have done all of the analyses, and we know that it cannot fail. And if it does fail, there are backup systems on top of backup systems on top of backup systems, and that's the end of it. Didn't use this example this term, but one of the best examples of the failure of this hubris, this approach to ignoring street-level knowledge and ignoring the public and over-relying on experts, happened some 30 years ago now, 3 Mile Island, which is a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. Some of you may remember reading about this. The power plant had a multiple failure in its safety systems, and the power plant actually began to melt down. The core actually went critical, and there was no cooling water to cool it off. It was a very, very dangerous situation. The only thing that averted the disaster was that it had a huge concrete containment structure, which did work. Contained most, not all, but most of the radiation. The federal government, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, said there's no danger. The risk is very low. However, as a precaution, all pregnant women in a 60-mile radius should probably get the you-know-what out. Now, what would your reaction be to that? I think I'd leave too, okay? And I suspect all of you would. You get the message. This was an effort at trying to take risk information, giving it a conservative estimation, and trying to reassure by instilling confidence in the public. It had the exact opposite effect. It backfired severely. Essentially, when the NRC said that, which was a wise thing to say, everybody got the message that these guys really don't have it under control. And this is really a bad thing and we ought to get out of here. And that's when the governor of Pennsylvania, a guy named Richard Thornburg, intervened and said, I'm taking charge, because you guys obviously don't know what you're doing. So we're going to evacuate everybody until this mess is straightened out. And anyway, so you get the picture. 2 other points. Translating expert knowledge into information that's actually usable by local populations through sensitivity to local cultural practices, norms, and traditions is essential. This is something that policy experts often don't do. And experts, in turn, need to incorporate community perspectives into their professional judgments to gather all the information needed for making good decisions. Elizabeth Blood, who's done a lot of work in this area in regards to environmental policy, and Frank Fisher, who's done a lot of work on this in regards to science and technology and risks, biotechnology, nuclear energy, and so forth, both argue citizen participation is important. This is one of the reasons why you want, we'll come back to this point next week when we talk about future of public policy, why you want the public involved in policy decisions. It's not just to get them to buy off on a policy. It's to get them to share information about what they think is really important. That's how you make sure that public policies work, at least in a democracy, where we believe that public policies ought to be working on behalf of a public good. Community expectations about schools, about local public health and nutrition, we talked about that, are also likewise similar examples of this problem. Questions about this? Comments? Does this make sense? So this is really a big, big problem. Victoria?
One of the things that stands out to me is before when we were talking, I think you mentioned like one of the issues with the No Child Left Behind was that it really stripped, the evaluation of it was stripping any context from like the broader social context. And I think these points bring in the context because people who are experiencing, you know, the education system, what have you, are navigating these places every day within the context of them. So
That's right.
that kind of bridging of
That's
the
right.
expert and the local brings in the context. So
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think that's an excellent point, and it is very important for this discussion because, again, it comes back to who is a policy expert? You know, we think of a policy expert from an evaluation standpoint. We'll look at some failures of that assumption momentarily. We think of an expert in policy evaluation as somebody who's very studious, who looks at a lot of aggregate data, who interprets it, who figures out the directionality and the intensity and all of this kind of thing. But it's decontextualized. Policies affect people. They affect their lives. They're perceived in various ways. You know, a danger of a nuclear power plant melting down is not just a set of scientific risks that can be calculated and computed. It's also people's lives and welfare. You're thinking about it in very personalistic terms. Schools. It's not just about scores. It's about, that's my kid, right? So it's a very good point. And we'll in fact see other examples of that as well. So let's turn to evaluation. Outcomes and evaluators. It should be pretty clear by now that evaluation is often termed the final stage of the policy process. We're going to see an illustration of that in a few moments. It is, as we've talked about throughout the quarter, and as Ray discusses, as Bovins and DeHart affirm, evaluation is often viewed as dispassionate, as detached, as scientific. It is usually neither of these things. It's neither scientific nor detached. It is agenda-driven. It is a part, in other words, of the policy process. It is valuational, which is to say almost every evaluation has a point of view, something that it is directing its attention to because the evaluator or the people paying for the evaluation believe that that point of view is important. And it is political. So a couple of issues, just to kind of open this up. The range of organizations doing evaluation and the approaches they employ. And secondly, the divergent ways in which problems can be defined and evaluated, both by policymakers and by analysts. Who are the evaluators? Well, evaluators take numerous forms. We've seen some of this already. Evaluators can be issue-based. They can be philosophy-based. You can pick your point of view. Do you want a liberal think tank? Do you want a conservative think tank? Do you want a vegetarian think tank? Whatever. Pick your point of view. They have different sources of funding, clients, and products. And evaluation has also become very much of a boutique industry, particularly in the United States and in a lot of other developed countries. Essentially, you can choose the kind of analysis you want. We talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago. We talked about the role of the policy analyst. You can analyze benefits and costs. You can analyze risks. You can analyze public support. You can analyze even all of those things. based on your goals, your policy orientation, your analytic approach, the major products that you want, and the stage of the process you want evaluated. Let me say one other thing that's sort of embedded in this but not explicit. You can choose the form that you want this evaluation to take. Do you want it to be a high-minded academic treatise that's only read by a handful of high-minded academics? Or do you want it to be in a newspaper or on the web where everyone will read it? Maybe create a blog. The way in which you market the evaluation is also a very important part of the policy process. This is one of the challenges that we face in public policy fields like education, where there's so much information out there, some of which is not really rigorously reviewed in terms of evaluation, that wherever it appears, whether in a newspaper, in a popular magazine, on the internet, oftentimes gets the same attention as a study, as something that may be more refined and more rigorous. A few weeks ago, I showed you a similar diagram outlining the entire policy process, the inputs, the agenda setting, the policy-making phase, that black box in which policies are formulated and then implemented, and then finally the outputs, the laws, the rules, the regulations, the programs that are created by governments. Well, this big blue loop is feedback. And that's really where evaluation fits in the policy process. Indeed, it is the last stage. But bear in mind, if you're following the logic of this diagram, it's also the first stage. It's a loop. A closed loop, perhaps, but it's a loop nonetheless. It's evaluation and policy impact assessment. Are policies meeting their goals and expectations? If they are, how can we make them even better? Or how can we change them in some other way? If they're not, how can we go back and revise or change the policy to make them succeed? Let me go through some of these points at the bottom of the screen. What I want you to carry from this discussion and from thinking about Bovens and Tart and other readings that you've looked at this quarter, when it comes to evaluation, is to realize that every stage of the policy process, every stage, features an interaction among competing interests. Just as there are competing interests that are seeking to create public policies, as we saw in our sub-government analysis some time ago, bear in mind that there are competing interests who are just waiting to evaluate policies. And they will evaluate them in divergent ways because they have different approaches and philosophies and expectations, all of which reflect those interests. This also explains why, at some level, all public policies could be seen as failures. Because if you stop and think about it, there are no outcomes in any policy that would ever be viewed as favorable by everyone. Think about the recent debate over the health care issue that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. If you are opposed to the notion of government providing an insurance, guaranteed set of insurance coverage for the uninsured, if you think that is a bad idea of public policy to be engaged in, if you think that creates too thick an approach to the role of government, would any evaluation of the effectiveness of that program please you? Probably not, except what? An evaluation that said what? Policy abjectly failed. And thus we need to do what? Trash it, get rid of it, end it, terminate it. No outcomes will ever be viewed as favorable. Failure is in the eyes of the beholder. But let me complicate matters just a bit. Think about this one. Even a success, in some ways, can be a failure. Assume that if a policy outcome is viewed as widely successful, will we want to leave the issue there? This is great. You know, the government has been spending billions of dollars over the past 45 years through the National Institutes of Cancer. And sure enough, what's happened to cancers in the United States? Gone up? What about deaths from cancers? Mortality. We're living longer. Actually, mortalities are going down. We're finding cancer sooner. More of them are proving to be treatable or operable. We know the causes of cancer. So what should we do? We're spending lots and lots of money on cancer research and other forms of medical research. Do we say, it's fine, leave it alone, don't break it, or what? Spend more. Spend more. And don't just spend more, take the same model and do what? If it's worked for cancer, replicate it. Do the same thing for every major disease. Create a national account that will direct money competitively to science, to universities, to medical centers, to do research and to develop treatments that will get into the marketplace and get into the healthcare industry and solve these problems. Now, is that a success or a failure? Or is it a little bit of both? What do you think? Depends on your perspective.
Well, I guess
If you're sick.
if you consider it as kind of a Darwinian system, that by the fact that the policy has perpetuated itself, it is successful. I mean, if you take that standpoint.
Right.
It doesn't really work the same for all diseases, though, because the healthcare industry is not going to support research for diseases that affect people that can't pay huge amounts for treatment.
There you go. That's
Cancer
it.
affects older and usually wealthier people.
That's it. We're going to pay to do the research to treat the illness. The assumption being that once the treatment is developed, somebody's going to pay for it, either through insurance or through their own means. That may work for cancer. It may not work for AIDS. Are we spending as much on AIDS? Are we spending as much for Tay-Sachs? Anybody know what Tay-Sachs is? Are we spending as much for them? No. There is a definite selection process. It is somewhat Darwinian, but I would sort of resist using a Darwinian analogy here, and simply say that there is a set of choices that are power-based. And it really do resonate with who speaks the loudest and who gets the most attention and resources. All programs that are successful fall short. They fall short in some way. National parks are wonderful. Let's have more of them. It's not enough to have national parks in rural, isolated, beautifully scenic areas. Let's have national parks in cities so that they'll be closer to people being able to get to them. It doesn't really raise the question as to whether or not that's the best means of protecting parklands, is to create national parks. Maybe it's better that they be state parks or city parks. It also doesn't answer the question as to how you then prioritize the allocation of the resources for this good. It's good, but does every park deserve equal protection, and will there be a steady stream of resources to support everything that we want to call a national park? Intuitively, you say, of course you want national parks, but wait a minute. Is that the best model for protecting public lands, or even creating or establishing public lands. Cancer research, public works programs likewise.
How do you see it personally about reconciling then like clinical research? If they surrender to the notion that things are place-based, then they're like undermining all of empiric research, the notion that things are generalizable. So that kind of protects, I think, this dichotomy where you have like the cancer research.
Right.
I mean, clinicians they do the scientific method, and it's the underpinning is that it's
Right.
generalizable. So it wouldn't change based on the street level bureaucracy or whatever.
Right.
So I don't know how to reconcile.
Okay, so let me give you one, this isn't going to answer it either, but it's one possible direction toward an answer, because this is in fact exactly how critics speak to the kind of argument you're speaking to. It's hard to argue against cancer research. It's very difficult, particularly since it is a ubiquitous set of, it's not one disease, it's a set of diseases that affects different populations, responds to different forms of treatment, has different both biophysical causes and environmental parameters, okay? So how can you argue against doing research to treat an illness that affects a lot of people? It makes you sound cruel and inhumane if you say that. But if you stop and think about it, if we know that many cancers are reducible to lifestyle choices, if we know that certain kinds of lung cancers resonate strongly with smoking or working around asbestos. How many of you work around? Just check. Working around asbestos or working around certain toxic hazards in the environment. Would it not perhaps be a better public policy choice to do what? Do what? To prevent those activities, to avert them, to protect against them, to regulate them. Eventually, what you would do is then bring down the rate of cancers that are quite preventable, and you might then have more resources for Tay-Sachs, okay, or other diseases and ailments. That doesn't quite answer your question, but it gets, I think, in the general vicinity of where we want to be. And it's not a question of, do we not care about the problem? Of course we care about the problem. The point is, and what evaluation research, that is the study of good and bad evaluation, should teach us to do, is to accurately define the problem and the best avenues for attacking it. Some problems clearly have to be attacked by research into treatment. In addition, some can best be attacked by prevention, aversion, circumvention, regulation. And that's really the point.
I think it's hard when you're working in evaluation, you are, just from personal experience,
Yes.
you're isolated from what maybe the actual problem is.
Yes.
And so your immediate problem that you're evaluating is maybe not the bigger problem that we're trying to address.
That's right.
So
And
there's
you're being
fragmentation.
asked to evaluate this. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So I think just in practice,
Yeah.
how do we negotiate that?
How do we negotiate these avenues? And in reality, what we normally do with health-related programs is we expect Congress to evaluate and make that combination of assessments when they fund programs. I'll use the example of cancer. The National Cancer Institute was one of the very first national health institutes established by the federal government. It was back in the late 1940s. There have since been a multiplicative number of national fill-in-the-blanks institutes, including one for environmental health, National Institutes of Environmental Health. Do these institutes talk to one another? It would stand to reason that they ought to in order to coordinate research dollars and attack the problem. What do you think? They don't talk to one another. They work in stovepipes. They're not the only ones, by the way. Most federal agencies work in stovepipes, most state agencies, most departments at UCI work in stovepipes. I can say that because it's true. I see it every day as a department chair. We wish it were otherwise, but unfortunately we tend to work on our own stovepipe. It's up to Congress to say, you know what, we're spending all this money on cancer research, maybe we ought to shift some of these funds to environmental health research so we could prevent some, right? That's what committee staffs in Congress do. This is one of the points that Radin makes some time ago, that this is sort of where the sausage gets made. Is that the best way to make this call? Is that the best way to do the coordination in terms of policy analysis? Probably not, because it's going to be very interest-driven. What do you mean you're going to cut some of the National Cancer Institutes to steer some of the money to the National Institutes for Environmental? No, we have to spend money on both. Not one or the other, or shift, or refocus the attention, or evaluate policy outcomes in a broader way. Each program wants to competitively evaluate itself to put what it's spending its money on in the best light, or to warrant additional support and additional funding. Before you get too pessimistic, you have every right to be pessimistic. I want to talk a little bit about policy evaluation from an overview standpoint. So it obviously is an interest-laden component of the policy process. And if that's true, then how is it conducted? And how do we determine whether something is going to be viewed as a success or a failure? And obviously the answer is it's subject to divergent perspectives. I want to talk for a few minutes on time as a perspective in policy evaluation. This is one that Bovens and Tarp devote a lot of attention to, but I think it's a very important one. We're actually going to be looking at some examples, some illustrations of this in a little bit. The data for evaluation. Let's get into some very basic methodological questions. Some of this picks up also on some of the questions and comments that you've been raising over the past few minutes. Short versus long. What's better? Do you want longitudinal data or do you want a one-year snapshot? Well, if you want accurate projections and interpretations, you want a longer-term view. The problem, however, ironically, as Bovens and Tarp point out, is that policy makers want what? They want the immediate results. We're spending several billion dollars on this program. That was a year ago. What have you got to show for it? How am I going to go to my voters in my district and say we ought to support this program because it looks like you feel really good about the data, and maybe in 8 or 9 years we're going to address that problem satisfactorily. You're going to have to give me something better to go on. Short term actually is the more common, even though longer term would be better. But then there's a flip side to that. The longer the time period over which you evaluate and assess a program, the more likely it is that the underlying public support and values that favor that program may do what? May change, may evolve, support may wax and wane. We talked about electoral cycles, public opinion cycles some time ago. We're going to come back to that point in just a little while with an example. If a policy regime, and by a regime we mean an array of laws and rules and regulations and programs to institute some policy outcome, persists for a long period of time, public attitudes toward the policy are likely to change. And with that change, sometimes, ironically, due to the success of the program. You promised you could accomplish your goal, and sure enough, you did. Now I ask you, why do we have to have that program anymore? And there's a time paradox. If a policy is successful, it is likely to be continued beyond its original anticipated duration. I mentioned this example last week. I want to allude to it again. Back in the early 1970s, when the federal government was running surpluses, that means that they were taking in more money than they could find a way to spend. What a nice problem. How many of you have that problem, by the way, with your checkbooks? This one? Okay. Never. All right. So we began a program called block grants, which were basically blocks of money that were given to states to spend however they wanted. There were no strings attached. The only strings attached were that you could not use the money to create any program that would discriminate against any categorical group. Outside of that, you could spend the money for whatever you wanted it to be. It was greatly flexible in terms of what you could spend the program money on. It was extremely popular because it meant that states had extra money that they didn't have to raise from their own taxes. And sure enough, the money was generally spent on things that were politically popular and most embraced by large numbers of people in states, like highways, like public works of various sorts. Energy price supports. Bovin Tart mentioned this one. Originally, back in the 1950s, the United States government created a lot of price supports for fossil fuels. Basically, these price supports were guaranteeing a minimum profit to energy explorers who found new sources of oil, coal, natural gas, fossil fuel, even uranium, when we thought nuclear power was going to grow and grow and grow. The idea was to create a program that would develop incentives to exploit these resources and guarantee a good supply of energy. They were supposed to be for fixed amounts of time, usually 5 years or so. Then, of course, they became renewed because they would prove to be very popular. The problem is, over time, it increases the likelihood of failure. What kind of failure? Well, in the case of block grants, the failure was what?
The surplus ended and the states had to reconcile with the new gap in their budget.
You're very, very close. That's a very rational outcome, what you've just discussed, Sally. Here's what actually happened. The surplus ended. The programs were so popular that the categorical block grants continued despite the absence of a surplus. So they had to be appropriated funds that added to the deficit. Then, after about a half a dozen years, they were eliminated and instead put into a series of specialized categorical grants that you had to apply for. So instead of just a block grant, the funds that would have been available were put into highway trust, other funds, other funding sources, so that they could go to these projects. It would have been rational to just end it, but that would have been politically suicidal for Congress to do. So they kept the program going, at least for about a half dozen years. Finally ended under Jimmy Carter, late Jimmy Carter's presidency. He didn't get reelected, by the way. Okay. Just checking. All right. Anyway, energy price supports. How is this an example of the time paradox? Did energy price supports work? Did they support energy exploration? Did they make it worthwhile for energy companies to take risks in finding new sources of petroleum and coal and natural gas? What do you think?
Well, artificially it did.
Artificially it did.
Because if you subsidize it, then it becomes worth it. But realistically, it's still not.
So what happens if you take away the price support? Which happened in the 1980s, by the way.
Then they're no longer viable.
And what happened to energy prices?
They go up.
They go up. Of course, there's plentiful energy, but you just got to stop eating so that you can afford to purchase it. Yeah. Two things happen. One is the prices skyrocketed because basically what the price supports did was artificially attenuate inflation. a certain amount of inflation in a resource is natural. When you hold it back for an indefinite period of time, you don't eliminate it, you only hold it back for a certain period of time. There had to be a natural market adjustment, and energy prices went up dramatically in the 1980s. Yes, partly due to energy embargoes for oil, but mostly because of the removal of these price supports. So that was one thing. Second thing, and a lot of research resources for the future, which is a think tank in Washington that's done work on this, argues that one of the things the price supports also did, which was actually successful, was it provided a means of lessening the risk upon energy companies who chose to explore for sources of energy, say, in the Middle East, or in Latin America, or in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, all of which were good in terms of expanding the base that you would have for energy. But what's the unintended consequence?
You should replace the gas revenue list.
Now, that would be putting it very nicely, yes. Not very friendly. The risk of an unstable energy supply that could be vulnerable to being cut off or reduced. We're seeing, again, yet another energy price shock in the past couple of weeks. And, simply stated, and if you look at the data on this, there's ample data, the amount of energy that the United States imports has over time increased. The amount of energy that's actually domestically produced has decreased proportionally, reinforcing the vulnerability. So you can have a success, you can have a failure, and let me add a third one. You can have a successful failure, or you can have a failed success. Take your pick. This is, in fact, what often happens with the time paradox. Questions on this? Again, you can't foresee. Or oftentimes it's difficult to foresee. Some other spatial and perceptual failures, and then I want to actually spend a few minutes looking at a real policy that shows us these paradoxes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking on this, although we will come back to some of these a little later on Thursday. But these are examples that are cited in Bowden's and to Hart, and also in other readings that you've seen this quarter. Facility siting issues often are public policies that are frequently cited when we talk about policy failures and policy evaluation. These are acronyms that many of you know from other contexts. What's a NIMBY? And what's in the Abbey? Not in anybody's backyard. No, I'm not against nuclear power in my backyard. I'm against it anywhere. Okay? And a LULU.
Locally undesirable land use.
There you go. Energy issues, waste management, homes and facilities for special populations, the mentally challenged or ex-convicts. These are also locally unwanted land uses. These are policy programs that in effect fail before they fail. They usually don't even get past the agenda setting stage because they are seen as issues that are so controversial and so likely to generate consequences that are unwanted and undesirable. And in the wrong-headed view of many of us, this is the point that both of us are made, in the wrong-headed view, if we simply didn't build these things, we wouldn't have a problem, which is ridiculous. No, you have a problem. There has to be, in a humane society, some way of providing homes for mentally challenged people, halfway houses for people out of prison. To say that if we didn't have the facility, we wouldn't have the potential for crime in our community, or my property values might decline a little bit, is maybe a valid argument, but it's a short-sighted argument. You still have the societal problem of how do you house populations, how do you provide them with services, how do you address the underlying problems that may have led to the need for these facilities to begin with? Simply saying this is a locally unwanted land use and put it all on the urban planner and say, it's your job to figure it out. Us policymakers are too tired to figure out what to do with crime. So it's up to you. You figure out how to prevent that facility from being sited here. Is wrong. Jurisdictional extension-ism issues, federalizing a state policy, the block grants would be a good example of that, or internationalizing a national program. Taking a problem like trade, for example, and putting it up into an international jurisdiction. Makes it harder to evaluate. And finally, social expectation issues. I want to go through these very quickly and then use an illustration in the time remaining. When a program and its cultural values are out of sync, civil rights programs for decades took this form. Public housing programs. We will look at public housing as a specific case study on Thursday. Kind of an interesting case. Public transit is the failure, the fact that we provide public housing, is the failure that we provide public transit, or is the failure and the reason these programs often do not manage to become self-sustaining or popular is because they are out of sync with the dominant values that we have as a society. Car equal freedom. Talked about that issue last week in the context of program funding, limitation. It's also a problem in terms of evaluation. Well, public transit is great, but it doesn't earn a profit. Why? Not only does it not earn a profit, it doesn't really sustain itself, its cost. It has to be subsidized. Well, I got news for you. Every form of transportation is subsidized. We should understand that's true with highways by now. We talked about the trust fund last week. And of course, public perception or unanticipated consequences. Again, land use decisions, housing, transportation, many environmental decisions. And a final observation before we go to an example. Think about this. It's easy to say this policy failed because. Or it's easy to say the cause of the failure was. But in fact, we would be much too simplistic if we said that. Failures, in quotes, are interconnected and systemic. They are failures not only of the outcome, they are failures of the process by which they became policies. And we're going to see some examples of this. The way you make the policy can often determine whether or not it's going to be a success or a failure. So, they're political failures, not just failures in programs. Questions?
One example of, I think it's a facility siting issue.
Yeah.
There's a law that's under court review in Florida that permitted sex offenders in Miami from living within 2,500 feet of anywhere that children gather.
Right.
But what it actually led to was eliminating all sources of housing.
Yeah.
Even for people who have already served their time, and so it created a population of sex offenders that had to live under a specific underpass in Miami, since it was the only area that was not within 2,500 feet. And so it's being reviewed as to whether you can continue to punish people after they've already served their time in prison, and whether this is discrimination.
Exactly, and that is a very interesting case too, because as you know, in the accounts of that case that I recall reading at least one account, I think it was in the New York Times, they were talking about that case as also exemplifying the further, in a sense, the further possible unintended consequence of doing exactly what you don't want to do, which is you don't want to take a population and sort of concentrate them in one area. You don't want to concentrate poverty. You don't want to concentrate people that have various problems of one sort or another that led to criminality. It is counter to things that we do know in good social science about how you don't solve problems, how you don't address them. We don't know how to solve them, but we know how not to. Then we'll leave it at that. If I can. Let me use an example that may not immediately come to your mind as a public policy. Any of you see the movie Apollo 13 some years ago? Great movie with Tom Hanks. It's a true story, by the way. On the left are some pictures of, that was me on my, I wish. This was Apollo 11, which was the first human landing on another world. It's still quite unbelievable that we ever actually had the national goal to do something like this, but we did. And there's a footprint, there's Neil Armstrong. The guy on the ladder is Buzz Aldrin, who, by the way, lives in Laguna Beach. He is a retired astronaut. Sometimes comes to UCI and gives talk. Fascinating individual. Great stories to tell, needless to say. First landing on the moon that happened in July of 1969. On the right is a Saturn V rocket that lifted the Apollo 13 mission, the one that was made into a movie, which was an aborted mission. It was a mission that failed in terms of what it intended to do, which was to take astronauts once again to the moon and land them and bring them back to Earth. But it was really a successful failure because they got back, even though, and it's interesting, one of the parts about that movie I love is here you have all this high technology, and they got back because of duct tape, coat hanger, plastic bags, socks. You really identified with it. Anyway, that was the Apollo 13 rocket. At the very top were the actual spacecraft that would land on the moon, and the service module that carried the craft. That's what exploded mid-flight. And by the way, if you ever go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, you can actually see this burnt capsule. That's what brought the first astronauts back from the moon. About as much room as a telephone booth, if you remember what telephone booths were. And the computer that powered that spacecraft was less sophisticated than the ones that we have over here. Pretty exciting program. What's this program all about? Well, it's a good object lesson in policy evaluation. The goal was to land an American on the moon and bring him or her back safely by the end of the decade. President Kennedy, in 1961, articulated this as a national goal. This was a very optimistic era. Can do. We can conquer everything. It's all a question of just applying ourselves to the problem. This was the Cold War. So, of course, it was not just a scientific mission. It was a political goal. We got to do this because the Soviet Union is going to do it if we don't. It succeeded by the end of the decade. $10 billion. Sound like a lot of money? Not today. But in the 1960s, that was real money. And it was divided into 3 sub-programs, which some of your parents probably may have some books or magazines, old newspaper clippings laying around showing this. These missions were called Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and each of them was to devise different spacecraft, different missions, and different technical feats, all of which were necessary to prove that you could actually land somebody on the moon and bring them home. Mercury was a one-person spacecraft, and they just showed that people could survive in space. Gemini was a 2-person spacecraft, and the idea was to show that you could dock and maneuver in space and do all the things that you'd have to do to eventually land on the moon. And then Apollo was actually to land on the moon. It was run by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which came into existence only 3 years before this goal was articulated. NASA was formed in 1958, and it was one of the most popular Cold War agencies in the United States. It was an agency whose aim was partly scientific. It sold its lavish and extravagant budget as being something that would help American science and technology. and also political. It would restore national prestige and, of course, land people on the moon. Some of you might remember another movie based on a book called The Right Stuff. The astronauts, the people that participated in this program, were national heroes. One person, I think Tom Wolfe, the author of that book, once said that, we don't have cowboys anymore, so this is it. Okay? These are the guys. But think about this, other benefits. This was a program that had numerous benefits, and right from the outset we knew these benefits would be built into it. Huge economic multiplier effects. California, where much of the program was based, Florida, and other Sun Belt states. It was mostly in the Sun Belt that the money was spent. For every dollar of public expenditure, there was a minimum of $5 to $7 in that community in other investments, other jobs, other spending programs. And we don't have a lot of time, we'll pick up on this on Thursday, but huge, almost incalculable technological spin-offs. Telecommunications, cell phones. The technology for cell phones actually came directly out of the space program, to be able to communicate great distances in a very small electronic device. Personal computers and digital technology directly came out of the space program. Materials science. These spacecraft, when they re-entered the atmosphere, had to endure tremendous temperatures. The same basic ceramic technologies have gone into things as varied as cookware, countertops. Who knows what else? Aerospace. Biometrics, being able to monitor medical activity in the human body. And of course, education. University of California is a land-grant university, which means we get money from the federal government for farms and agriculture. We're also a sea-grant university, which means we get money to study oceanography. And there is actually a program called the Space Grant Program. We get money to study other worlds. It's money that was spent out of the space program. Huge success. Huge success.
Okay. I think I'd like to comment on we really shouldn't underplay the, when we were talking about the cultural success of it. I personally, my girlfriend's father grew up in Scotland and saw all this happening.
Yes.
And wanted to be a part of it, and everyone looked at him and thought that he was crazy. And now he came over here, he studied, he's now working in Space Park. It's hard to
You're exactly right, and that's the point I want to leave you with. We're going to pick up on this on Thursday, but that's the key point. This was a program that was so popular, it was impossible to envision how anyone wouldn't want to continue a program like this. But we didn't. Why didn't we? Save the suspense until Thursday. Let me go.